I need to tell you something that I've thought about almost every single day for the past 3 years. It started with a taxi ride, a quiet one. A man who barely said 20 sentences the entire trip, and somehow, that ride ended up being the reason I'm not still out there driving circles around the city at 2 a.m., wondering when my life is actually going to begin. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like one of those stories where someone dresses up a coincidence in meaningful clothes and calls it fate. But I'm asking you to stay with me, because by the time I get to the end, by the time I tell you what I found out about who that man actually was and why he really chose me, I think you're going to feel it the same way I did. Like something shifted. Like the ground moved just slightly under your feet. My name is Daniel, and back then I was about as far from special as a person can get while still technically functioning. I was 26, I drove a taxi 6 nights a week, I slept until noon, ate whatever was fast and cheap, and every few weeks I'd sit at my kitchen table with a notebook I'd been filling for 2 years and tell myself that one day I was going to do something with what was inside it. One day. Soon. Any time now. I'd been saying that since I was 23. My shift ran from around 9 at night to 4 or 5 in the morning, sometimes later if the money was thin and I needed to make up the difference. After 3 years of that schedule, I knew the city the way you only know a place when you've moved through it in silence, alone, in the dark. Not as a visitor, not as someone passing through, but as someone who belongs to its nighttime hours whether they want to or not. I knew which streets flooded when the rain came sideways. I knew which corners got rowdy after midnight and which blocks stayed quiet all the way to dawn. I knew the late-night spots that were actually good versus the ones that just stayed open. I knew which traffic lights had sensors and which ones were on timers, and how to get across the financial district in 8 minutes at 1 a.m. versus 45 at 5 in the afternoon. The city at night was mine. In a way, it was the only thing that was. Most of my passengers were forgettable, in a gentle way. Not because they were bad people, just because they were tired and going somewhere and didn't particularly need anything from me beyond a smooth ride. Drunk birthday parties, business travelers staring at their phones, couples who'd clearly had an argument before getting in the car and sat in practiced silence all the way home. The occasional late shift nurse who'd fall asleep 3 minutes in and jerk awake when I pulled up to the address. I didn't mind any of it. I had nowhere else to be. That particular night was a Thursday in November, cold and drizzling. That specific kind of late autumn rain that isn't heavy enough to be dramatic, but gets into everything anyway. It fogs up the edges of your windshield and makes the streetlights blur into soft halos, and the whole city looks like it's slightly out of focus. I'd been complaining about it to myself for most of the shift. Slow night. The heater in my car making that intermittent rattling sound it made when it was debating whether to give up entirely. I'd gotten maybe 4 rides in 4 hours. It was the kind of night where you start doing the math in your head, and the math keeps coming back bad. I got a pickup request at 11:45 from an address near the old financial district. The kind of area that's all glass and stone and expensive shoes during business hours, and then goes almost completely silent after 8. I pulled up expecting the usual, some mid-level corporate type working late, or someone leaving one of the upscale restaurants a few blocks over. What I found instead was a man standing at the curb in the rain without an umbrella, not checking his phone, not pacing, not ducking under the building's awning 10 feet away, just standing there, completely still. Like someone had placed him on the sidewalk, and he had decided to remain exactly where he was, regardless of weather, regardless of anything. I remember noticing that immediately and thinking it was a strange choice. Most people in the rain do something. They shift, they look up, they at least pull their collar up. This man was doing none of those things. He was just standing in it, like the rain was happening in a different dimension and wasn't entirely relevant to him. He was older, mid to late 60s, I'd say. Average height, average build. He wore a dark coat that I could tell, even from the car, was expensive. Not because it was flashy, but because of the opposite reason. The way it sat on him, the way it moved. Cheap coats look like coats. That one looked like it had been made for a specific person. His silver hair was neatly combed despite the rain, which I still don't fully understand. There was something about his face. I thought this even at the time, like I'd seen him somewhere before. Not in a specific memory, more like he had one of those faces that your brain catalogs as familiar, even when it has no real reason to. He got in unhurriedly, settled into the back seat with the kind of deliberate calm you don't often see in people who've just been standing in the rain. No, sorry to keep you waiting. No, terrible night. No small talk opener of any kind. Just the address, said clearly and without hurry, and then silence. I started driving. The first 5 minutes were quiet. I was used to quiet. Quiet was fine. Then he said, "How long have you been doing this?" I glanced up at the rearview mirror. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking out the side window at the wet streets passing by. "Driving? About 3 years," I said. He nodded slowly, like that number meant something to him, like he was placing it somewhere in his mind. Then silence again for another minute or two. "Do you like it?" And here's the thing. I get asked that question occasionally, and I always have the same answer ready. Something about the hours being flexible or the freedom of it, something that isn't a lie, but also isn't the truth. It's the kind of answer that closes the conversation politely. I was halfway through forming that answer when I stopped. Maybe it was because he hadn't glanced at his phone once since he got in. Most people check their phones within 60 seconds of sitting down in a car. It's practically a reflex at this point. He hadn't touched it. Maybe it was the way the question had come out. Not like small talk, not like something to fill silence, but like he actually wanted to know. Like the answer was going to be filed somewhere and referenced later. "Honestly," I said. "Not really, but it pays." He made a small sound in the back of his throat. Not a laugh, something more neutral than that. Acknowledgement, maybe. "What would you rather be doing?" I don't fully know why I told him. I've thought about it many times since, and I still don't have a clean answer. Something about the stillness of him. Something about the way the question sat in the air without any pressure attached to it. There was no sense that he was going to evaluate my answer or be impressed or unimpressed. He just asked it the way you ask something when you genuinely want to know. So I told him. About the 2 years of night classes I'd done before the money ran out. About the logistics idea I kept coming back to. Nothing glamorous, just connecting small local food suppliers with independent restaurants, cutting out the middlemen that were eating everyone's margins. About the notebook on my kitchen table where I'd been mapping it out for 2 years. Pages of it. Cost breakdowns and supplier contacts and rough revenue models. I told a stranger, sitting in my back seat, more about that notebook in 10 minutes than I'd told most people I actually knew. He listened to every word. No interjections, no, "that's interesting," at polite intervals, just actual listening, the kind that has weight to it. When I finished, he said, "The notebook is important, don't lose it." Not that sounds promising, or "have you looked into funding?" or any of the 20 responses a person could give. Just that, the notebook is important, don't lose it. And then he went quiet again. We arrived at his destination a few minutes later, a building I didn't recognize, not marked, no sign, no logo on the door, just a plain entrance with a single light mounted above it and a keypad on the wall. Clean and understated in a way that, now that I think about it, felt more deliberate than accidental. Some buildings want you to know they're important. This one wanted you to walk right past it. He paid the fare exactly, left a reasonable tip, and opened the door. And then he said, "Drive safe, Daniel." I pulled away from the curb. I was half a block down the street before it arrived. Not slowly, but all at once, like a switch. I had never told him my name. I turned that over in my mind for days. Not obsessively. I had shifts to run and money to make, and I wasn't going to let one strange moment send me down a rabbit hole. But it kept returning to me at odd moments. Stopped at a light, waiting on a pickup, lying in bed at 6 a.m. when I should have been asleep. The quiet replay of the whole ride, looking for the moment where I'd introduced myself. And every time, I came back empty. I checked the app. The ride was registered to M. Reeves, first initial, last name, no additional information. That's how the platform handled it. Normal. Nothing there to explain anything. I told myself the most reasonable explanation. I must have said my name at some point and simply didn't remember it. People do that. You say your name in passing, reflexively, and it doesn't register as a moment worth remembering. That had to be it. That was almost certainly it. The other explanation, that he'd already known it before he got in the car, I wasn't ready to look at directly. So I put it on a shelf and left it there. A week went by. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was eating lunch and watching nothing on my phone, a number I didn't recognize lit up my screen. I almost let it go to voicemail. My policy with unknown afternoon numbers is pretty firm. Nothing good has ever come from picking one up without warning. But I picked it up anyway. I still don't know exactly why. Daniel? Not a question. Not, is this Daniel, or am I speaking with Daniel? Just my name, stated, like a fact being confirmed. I recognized the voice before my brain had consciously processed it. There was something specific about the way he spoke, a measured quality, like there was a slight pause before each sentence where he'd decided exactly what to say and how. Not rehearsed, more like careful. Yes, I said, and I sat up straight without deciding to. This is the passenger you drove last Thursday, near the financial district, the rain. I remember, I said. I have a small request, he said. I need someone I can trust to drive me to 3 locations next Saturday afternoon. I expect it would take about 4 hours total. I'll pay well above your standard rate. I want to pause here for a second and ask you something honestly, because I think about this all the time. What would you have done? On paper, the situation is this. A man you drove once, whose last name you're not sure of, who somehow knew your name before you told him, who now has your personal number, which is definitely not listed on the app. This man is calling you with a vague request involving an unspecified amount of money to drive him to unnamed locations. The answer that makes sense is no. Politely, firmly, no. And I ran through that answer in my head while he was waiting on the other end of the line. I genuinely considered it. But here's what I kept coming back to. Everything about the way he spoke was the opposite of how someone sounds when they're trying to manipulate you. There was no urgency to it, no pitch, no attempt to sweeten the deal before I'd even responded. He said what he needed, he named the terms, and then he went quiet. Like the decision was entirely mine, and he had no particular investment in which way it went. People who want something from you don't sound like that. In my experience, people who want something from you fill the silence. Okay, I said. I can do Saturday. Good, he said. I'll text you the first address Friday night. He hung up before I could ask a single follow-up question. I sat there for a minute with my phone in my hand, thinking about what I'd just agreed to, and not entirely being able to explain it. If any of this resonates with you, if you've ever said yes to something you couldn't fully rationalize, let me know in the comments, because I genuinely love to know I'm not alone in that. And if you're here for the first time and you want to know where this goes, subscribe and stay, because this is the part where things start to get strange. Saturday arrived gray and cold, the kind of late November day that never quite decides to be anything. The text had come Friday night, just an address, nothing else. No instructions, no see you then, no context. An address and a time, 12:30. I pulled up to find him standing outside a house in a quiet residential neighborhood. The kind of street that isn't wealthy, but is taking care of itself. Modest houses, clean sidewalks, a few old trees that had dropped most of their leaves by now. He was on the front step, speaking with an older woman in the doorway. She looked tired in the way people look when they've been through something long and difficult. He said something brief to her, and she nodded and touched his arm once, quickly, and he turned and walked toward my car. He got in and handed me a folded piece of paper with an address written in neat, small handwriting. Not typed, handwritten. I noticed that. This time he talked more. Not a lot, but more. He asked about my family the way you ask when you actually want to understand a person's context, not just fill a conversation. He asked if my parents were still alive, whether I had brothers or sisters, what my father had done for work. I told him. My father was a construction foreman who'd spent 30 years doing physical work and now had bad knees and a small house an hour outside the city and a garden he was unreasonably proud of. "Did the two of you get along?" he asked. I took a moment with that one, not because I didn't have an answer, just because it was more specific than I expected. Most people who ask about your family take it at surface level. He was asking underneath it. "Mostly," I said. "When I was a teenager, not really. He wanted me to follow a certain path, and I didn't, and that caused problems for a while. But we worked it out eventually." He looked out the window and said, very quietly, "That's good." Not as a pleasantry. Something more private than that. Like he was saying it to someone who wasn't in the car. The first stop was a hardware store. He went in alone, was there for maybe 8 minutes, came back without buying anything visible, and said to head to the next address. I didn't ask. The second stop was an office building on the edge of the financial district. Small, 5 or 6 stories, the kind that houses accountants and small legal practices and consultants who don't need a prestigious address. He told me to wait in the car. He was gone for close to 25 minutes. When he came back, he was carrying a large sealed envelope. Thick, the kind that holds something substantial. He sat with it in his lap, and I pulled back into traffic. It was at the third stop that something happened that I still think about. I was parked outside a restaurant, closed for the day, chairs up on tables inside, while he knocked at the side door. While he was inside, a man came up to my car. Maybe 40, well-dressed, the kind of well-dressed that's trying to communicate something. He tapped on my passenger window. I rolled it down a few inches. "You're driving him today?" he said, nodding toward the restaurant. "I'm waiting for a passenger," I said. "Right." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded set of bills. He held them up. "There's 500 here. I need you to tell me where he's going after this." I stared at the money for a second. $500 was real. 500 was 2 of my best nights combined. "No," I said. He looked at me for a moment, recalibrating. 1,000, he said. "No," I said again, and rolled the window back up. I sat there with my hands on the wheel and my heart beating faster than it had any business doing. I don't know exactly who that man was or what he wanted. I don't know what the envelope contained or what business the old man was doing in that restaurant. And honestly, in that moment, I really, genuinely did not know if I was sitting in the middle of something I shouldn't be in the middle of. What I knew was that something in me had answered before my brain caught up, and it had answered no. When he came back out 2 minutes later, the other man was gone. He got in, looked at me, and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Are you honest, Daniel?" My hands were still on the wheel. "I try to be," I said. He was quiet for a few seconds, looking at the envelope in his lap. "That's the right answer," he said. "Most people say yes immediately. You took a moment." He didn't say anything else. I didn't tell him about the man at the window. Not then. I just drove. But I felt it, unmistakably, the sense that something had been marked down somewhere, some kind of record I couldn't see. I went home that night and tried to think about it rationally. I laid everything out in my mind the way you do when you're trying to keep things straight. An older man, clearly wealthy, calm to a degree that bordered on unusual. He knew my name before I told him. He had my private number. He'd paid me 3 times the going rate, in cash, no questions. He asked about my family with the focus of someone conducting research rather than making conversation. He carried a large, sealed envelope to a nondescript office building and said nothing about what was inside it. And a man in expensive clothes had just offered me $1,000 at a restaurant side door to tell him where we were going next. I sat with all of that for a while. Then I spent 2 evenings running searches. M. Reeves, the address from that first night, the restaurant, the office building. I hit walls everywhere. Multiple people with that name variation, none of whom clearly matched him. The building came up under a holding company with no public-facing description. The restaurant was real and unremarkable and had no obvious connection to anything. I called Marco. Marco has been my friend since we were in school together, and his primary value as a friend is that he will tell you when you're being stupid without enjoying it too much. I laid out everything. He listened without interrupting, which is unusual for Marco. When I finished, he said, "Okay, so 2 possibilities. 1, this guy is just very wealthy and very eccentric, and for whatever reason, he's decided he likes you. Rich people do weird things, that's just true. 2, he's running some kind of operation, and you're a useful person because you're mobile and anonymous, and he's been watching you to see if you can be trusted." Trusted for what? That's what I don't know. And that's the part that would concern me. I asked if I should just stop picking up his calls. Marco said that was probably the safe play. Then he said, "But you're not going to do that, are you?" It wasn't a question. He called again 4 days later. I picked up. This time, it was different. No errand, no driving. He said he had a personal matter to attend to on Thursday night, late, around 10, and he'd like me to drive him. He said, "It's not complicated, but it's somewhat unusual, and I think you should know that before you agree." "How unusual?" I asked. A pause, longer than his usual ones. "We'll be going to a cemetery," he said. Silence. "I understand completely if you'd rather not," he said. The same quality as always, no pressure, no manipulation, just in an offer that came with its own door out. I want to be completely straight with you here. I have gone back to this moment more times than I can count. The word cemetery. 10 o'clock at night. A man I couldn't fully identify, who had tested me in ways I didn't entirely understand, who was connected to a sealed envelope and a man offering cash at a side door. This was, objectively, the moment to say no. I said, "I'll be there." I don't know how to explain that decision except to say that my gut had been telling me something since the first night, and my gut and my fear were saying different things, and I chose to listen to the one that wasn't scared. Whether that's wisdom or just a particular kind of foolishness, I honestly still don't know. But Thursday came. He was standing outside his building at exactly 9:55. He was carrying a single white flower, a lily, I'm fairly sure, wrapped loosely in a paper sleeve, held carefully at his side like something that could be damaged if you weren't paying attention. He got in without speaking and gave me the name of a cemetery on the east side of the city. The city at 10 on a Thursday night has its own particular quiet. Not the loud hush of a weekend or the tense silence of very early morning. Something more settled than that. The roads were mostly clear, and the drive took about 25 minutes, and we made it almost entirely in silence. He held the flower in both hands for most of the trip, looking ahead. When we arrived, the cemetery gates were open. It was one of those older ones that doesn't close at night. Just gets dark and still. He asked me to park along the curb outside the entrance and told me I was welcome to wait in the car. He'd be back. I watched him walk through the gate. The path inside was marked by small lights set into the ground on either side, the kind that barely illuminate anything, just enough to walk by without stumbling. He moved with the certainty of someone who has made this trip many times before, not looking at markers or numbers, following a route he had memorized. The light was dim and foggy, and I watched him get smaller as the path bent, and then he was gone into the dark between the rows. I sat in the car. I want to tell you what it feels like to sit outside a cemetery at 10 at night, watching a man you don't know disappear into it carrying a flower. It feels like the outside edge of something you don't entirely have language for. Not frightening exactly, but quiet in a way that gets into you. The kind of quiet that makes you think about things you don't usually think about time, about what people leave behind, about the fact that every single one of those markers represented someone whose life had specific details and specific people who missed them. I sat with that for 30 minutes. When he came back, he was carrying nothing. He moved a little more slowly than when he'd gone in, and when he got into the car, he didn't say anything for a moment, just sat, looking straight ahead, somewhere that wasn't the windshield. Then he said, "Thank you for coming." "Of course," I said, and I meant it. He asked if I'd eaten. I hadn't. He asked me to drive to a place he knew nearby that stayed open late. We parked and went inside. A small, warm place, almost empty at that hour. The kind of restaurant that has the same menu it's had for 20 years and doesn't apologize for it. He ordered coffee and food for both of us without asking what I wanted, which normally would have bothered me. It didn't. We sat by the window. He was quiet for a while, looking out at the empty street. Then he said, "How old are you, Daniel?" 26, I said. He received that the same way he received most things, with stillness. Then he was quiet again. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, the heavier kind. The kind where the person across from you is standing at a doorway deciding whether to go through. "I had a son," he said. I didn't move. He would have been 28 this year. I let that sit. I didn't rush to fill it. "He drove taxis for a while," he said. "When he was young, before he started figuring things out. He had a notebook he carried everywhere, full of ideas, business ideas mostly. He was always writing in it. He never quite got to the point where he acted on them. I felt something move through me slowly, like a current underwater. A coincidence. It has to be a coincidence. People drive taxis. People keep notebooks." But I didn't say that. I just waited. "What happened to him?" I asked quietly. He looked down at his coffee cup. "An accident. 4 years ago. He was 24. He said it cleanly, like a sentence he had practiced until it no longer broke apart in his mouth when he said it out loud. No elaboration. He didn't break down. He just sat with the fact of it, the way you sit with something that has already done all the damage it's going to do. We finished the food. He thanked me again, and I drove him home, and I told him goodnight, and drove back to my apartment. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I thought about the notebook on my kitchen table, about the questions he'd asked me about my father and whether we got along, about the 30 minutes he'd spent in the dark between the graves while I sat in the car and thought about time, about a young man with a notebook full of ideas who drove taxis and died at 24. I didn't sleep for a long time that night, and when I finally did, I dreamed about something I couldn't remember in the morning, but woke up feeling like I'd been somewhere I couldn't name. He called 3 days later. Not to arrange a ride, he made that clear immediately. He asked if I'd be willing to meet him at a cafe downtown on Thursday afternoon, just to talk. I said yes. He was already at the table when I arrived, 2 coffees waiting. He looked different in full daylight, more present somehow, more dimensional. At night, in the car, he'd always seemed like something slightly outside the normal frame of things. In the afternoon light of a corner cafe, he was just a man, an older one, with deep lines around his eyes and the particular tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with years. He told me his full name that afternoon. I'm going to keep it out of this story, not to be mysterious, but because he was a private man, and he was private for real reasons, and I think that deserves to be honored. But I'll tell you this, when I got home and searched it, I sat down in my chair and read for a very long time, and then sat without reading for even longer. He wasn't just wealthy in the way that comfortable people are wealthy. He had built something from the ground up, a company that became a platform that became the foundation of 3 other companies, over about 30 years. The kind of person who is referenced in financial reporting occasionally, but doesn't do profiles, doesn't maintain any public presence, doesn't need the visibility. There was one photograph of him online from something like 15 years ago at an industry event. He looked more or less the same, but in that cafe on Thursday afternoon, he was none of that. He was a man with tired eyes who ordered plain coffee and chose every word before he spoke it. He told me about his son, more than he had at the restaurant after the cemetery. He told me his name was Eli, that Eli had been sharp in a way that occasionally made him difficult, quick and funny and unwilling to accept things at face value, always poking at the logic of whatever someone had just said. He said they'd argued a lot during Eli's early 20s, about the taxi work, which the father had seen as stalling, about the notebooks, which the father had dismissed as distraction, about the sense that Eli was circling something great without committing to it. I told him to get serious, he said, more than once. I told him the notebooks were a fantasy and that he needed to focus on something real. He was looking at his coffee. I thought I was helping. I thought that's what you do. You push people toward clarity, toward action. He stopped. And then he was gone, he said. Instantly. No conversation before it, no warning, just gone. And I never got to see what the notebooks would have become. He looked up at me, and I knew. I'd been moving toward knowing since the night at the restaurant, but now I knew completely. The night you picked me up, he said, you reminded me of him. Not your face is your own, but the way you spoke, the way you said the word honestly before you said something true. Eli did that. Every time he was about to tell me something he actually meant, he'd say honestly first. I hadn't heard anyone do that in 4 years. I didn't say anything. There are situations where the respectful response is silence, and I knew I was in one of them. I want to be clear with you, he said, and the precision in his voice sharpened slightly. I am not trying to replace him. I'm not confused about who you are. You are not Eli, and I'm not looking for a substitute. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I know exactly what this is and what it isn't. He said it firmly, like he needed it documented. But I have been thinking for 4 years about what I would have done differently, what I would have said, and I keep coming back to the same 2 things. I would have listened more, and I would have helped sooner. Before he was ready, by my definition of ready. Just sooner. I felt something constrict in my chest. Not grief, something adjacent to it. So the errands were tests, I said. It wasn't quite a question. I needed to know who you were when there was nothing impressive at stake. People behave for money. They perform when they sense an opportunity. I wanted to see what you were like when you thought I was just an unusual old man and there was nothing to perform for. The man who approached you outside the restaurant, did you consider it? My breath caught slightly. So he had known. For about 2 seconds, I said. He almost smiled. Not quite. Eli would have said 2 seconds too, he said quietly, and then the same answer. I looked at the table for a moment. The cemetery, I said. I go every month, he said. I wanted to see how you handled something that has no comfortable response, whether you'd push for information or give me space, whether you'd make it about your discomfort or mine. You gave me room, he said. Eli would have done that. I looked down at my coffee cup, and I didn't say anything for a moment because I wasn't entirely sure what would come out if I did. When I looked up, he was watching me with an expression that I want to describe carefully because it's been important to me to describe it accurately. It wasn't pity. Pity would have been smaller, and it would have been about him, and this wasn't. It was something closer to a kind of serious care, the expression of someone who has thought about something for a long time and is now prepared to act on it. I want to invest in you, he said. Not out of grief, not as a tribute to Eli, as a decision made by someone who has been evaluating people for 40 years and who recognizes a specific quality when he sees it. He held my gaze. The quality of someone who will actually follow through. He told me he'd done some looking into the logistics idea I described in the car. He'd talked to a few people who knew the supplier landscape in my area. He said the concept wasn't original, nothing is at the foundation, but that execution was the entire game, and everything he'd seen told him I was someone who would do the work. He put a card on the table, plain white handwritten, a name and a phone number. He told me it was the name of a person at a firm that handled early-stage investment, and that they knew who he was and would take the meeting. You don't have to use it, he said. I mean that. If you'd rather this just be what it's been, someone who drove me and someone I talked to, that's a complete ending and I'll respect it. But if the notebook is real, call that number. I looked at the card. Why? I asked. I know that sounds like a strange thing to say when someone is handing you something valuable, but I needed the human answer, not the business one. Why me? Why now? Why any of this? He thought for a moment, and then he said something I have written down and kept folded in the back of my notebook ever since. Because Eli didn't get his chance, he said, and because I spent 4 years watching people with a fraction of his ability get 10 times his opportunity simply because of where they started or who they happened to know. And at some point, I decided that I was going to stop watching that and start doing something about it. He looked at the card between us. And because the first night I heard you say, honestly, I understood for the first time since Eli died that the thing I'd spent 4 years regretting wasn't just about him. It was about what I'd believed, that people needed to be ready before they deserved help, that you made someone earn the support before you offered it. Eli didn't need me to make him earn it. He was already earning it. I just never told him I could see that. He looked up. You're already earning it, he said. I can see that. And this time, I'm not going to wait. I picked up the card. I called that number. I won't walk you through every step of what happened after. Some of it is still ongoing, and this isn't a story about business mechanics. But the short version is this. The meeting happened. The investment happened. The logistics company I'd mapped out in a notebook on my kitchen table exists now and runs and has real contracts with real suppliers and real restaurants and employs people and is growing in a way I let myself believe in about 6 months in and haven't stopped since. He and I still talk. Not often. He's not someone who keeps relationships warm through volume. But a few times a year there's a text or a call, always brief, always asking the same basic question. How is it going? And I tell him honestly, because that's the only way I know how to talk to him. Once a year, in November, I drive to a cafe. He's always there when I arrive. 2 coffees on the table. He talks about Eli occasionally. Not heavily, not with the weight of someone who is still being crushed by it, but with the quieter weight of someone who has learned to carry it without it stopping them from walking. He'll mention something Eli would have found funny or something he would have argued about, and we'll sit with it for a moment, and then we move on. That's how it goes. I think about that November night more than I think about almost anything. The rain, the stillness of him on the curb, the way the word honestly came out of my mouth without me thinking about it, and the way it landed somewhere I couldn't see. I think about the notebook, about the number of times I almost threw it away, about the story I kept telling myself, that caring about an idea too much before you could prove it was going anywhere was naive, that serious people kept their heads down and didn't spend time on things that might never become anything. I'd absorbed that somewhere, the way you absorb things before you know you're absorbing them, and I'd been slowly using it to talk myself out of my own life. A man I'd never met got into my taxi in the rain and recognized something in me by a single word. And then, for reasons that had everything to do with love and loss and regret and the specific kind of determination that comes from understanding what it costs to wait too long, he decided to do something about it. I don't think everything happens for a reason. I want to be honest about that. I've never found that idea fully convincing. But I do think that certain moments are hinges, that the door swings one way or the other, and everything on the other side is different depending on which way it goes. The hinge, for me, was a word. And the lesson, if you can call it that, isn't that the right person will come along and fix things. It's that you have to be someone worth finding in the moment when someone is looking. You have to have a notebook. You have to have an answer when someone asks what you'd rather be doing. You have to be honest before you say the thing that actually matters. You can't control who gets into your car, but you can control who they find when they do. If this story stayed with you, if any part of it landed somewhere that felt real, I'd love to know which moment hit you the hardest. Drop it in the comments. I genuinely read them, and some of the things people have written under this kind of story have meant a lot to me. And if you're new here and this is the first time we've met, subscribe. I tell these kinds of stories because I think they matter. The quiet ones. The ones about two people in a car in the rain, where nothing explodes and nobody saves the world, but something real changes anyway. There's more where this came from. Until next time.